Mac Delgado was elbow-deep in a dead Thren skiff, narrating the autopsy to nobody, when his welding torch sputtered and reminded him that this was, in fact, his life now. "Yeah," he said, watching the blue flame cough and die. "That's going to need a part replacement." He set the torch down on the deck plate of Hollow Reach Station's No. 6 bay, a cavern of scrap metal and dead hulls that smelled like ozone and hot iron, and wiped his hands on a rag that had stopped being clean sometime around the Clinton administration. 41 years old, 6'1", built like a man who used to lift transmissions out of D9 dozers for a living, with a left forearm that didn't bend the way the rest of him did. Titanium plate under synthetic skin, fused into what was left of the bone after a roadside outside Helmand had decided he didn't need that arm the regular way anymore. Doctors back home called it a marvel of modern prosthetic integration. Mac called it the good arm because it was the one that didn't ache when the weather changed, on account of not technically being weather-related tissue. He looked up past the gantry cranes at the ship sitting in dry dock Cradle 4, the one every salvage hand on this station had laughed at when he'd put his bid in. 300 meters of pitted black hull, sensor arrays burned out, no registry transponder, hull markings scoured down to ghost letters nobody could read anymore. The auctioneer, a Thren broker with too many joints in his fingers, had called it non-functional pre-accord debris, sold as is, no warranty implied or possible. Everybody else called it the ugliest hunk of dead metal in 3 sectors. Mac called it Sophia's watch because that's the name he'd painted on the hull himself, freehand, the night after he closed the deal. He hadn't told anybody back home what he'd actually spent on it. Hadn't told them because there wasn't anybody left to tell. His ex-wife Diane had stopped picking up 2 years before the cancer took their daughter. And after the funeral, after the folding of the flag nobody had actually given him because Sophia hadn't been military, after the house got sold and the dog went to his sister-in-law, after all of that, there'd only been one number on the ledger that still meant anything. Sophia's college fund, $41,300 sitting in an account meant to send a 14-year-old who loved astronomy to a school she was never going to see. He'd told himself it wasn't waste. He'd told himself, standing in that auction yard on Hollow Reach with the fund converted into alien script that smelled faintly like burnt coffee, that a man could take grief and weld it into something useful, that a dead girl's tuition money could become a ship, and a ship could become work, and work could become a way to keep other people's kids alive a little longer than his had gotten to live. It was a stupid, sentimental, financially insane decision, and he'd do it again tomorrow. He remembered the week before the auction more clearly than he wanted to, sitting on the floor of a storage unit outside Toledo with a box of Sophia's things in his lap, the telescope she'd saved birthday money for 2 years running, the astronomy textbooks with her handwriting crammed into the margins, a stuffed dog with one ear chewed soft from 11 years of being slept on, running the math over and over on a cracked phone screen, trying to find a version of the numbers where he didn't have to do what he already knew he was going to do. He'd sold the telescope to a kid 2 streets over for $60 less than it was worth, because the kid's mom had looked at him with an expression that said she understood exactly what kind of grief made a man sell his daughter's telescope, and he hadn't had it in him to negotiate against that look. The textbooks went to a library donation bin, the dog he'd kept, and it sat now on a shelf in his bunk on Hollow Reach, one chewed ear and all, the last thing he hadn't been able to let the math touch. The college fund had been different. The college fund had felt somehow less like giving something up and more like finishing a sentence Sophia never got to finish herself. She'd wanted to study the stars. He couldn't give her that anymore. But he could take the money meant to get her there and put it into something that left this dirt-poor little station's 2 scrap kids, Elo, with her constant questions about why metal did what metal did, and Vex, who'd once spent 4 hours trying to fix a broken scanner because nobody had told him it wasn't worth saving. A little more of a future than they'd had the week before. It wasn't the same thing. Mac knew that better than anybody. But it was the only math that had ever come out feeling like something other than loss. Mac! Priya's voice cracked across the bay's PA, the old quartermaster's accent thick with the kind of fatigue that came from running a scrapyard with a skeleton crew and a payroll that paid in protein paste. Mac, get up here. Ship's incoming, not ours. He didn't run. 41-year-old combat engineers with one half titanium arm didn't run unless they had to, on account of bad knees and a healthy respect for gravity. But he moved fast, grabbing the plasma cutter off the bench, a Milwaukee unit he'd jury-rigged off a salvaged housing, the brand name still legible under a layer of grime, because some things just worked better than the local stuff, and headed for the catwalk. 3 ships were settling into the station's outer ring, sleek and segmented, the color of dried blood under the docking lights. They conquered. He'd seen the silhouette in the station's threat database once, filed under Repossession Avoid. The Concorde didn't ask. The Concorde assessed value, decided who owned what, and took it. They run scans on Dry Dock 4, Priya said, appearing at his elbow, her 4 eyes, the inner pair milky with age, fixed on the readout in her hand. Your ship. They've got a registry flag on your ship, Mac. It's not registered to anybody. I bought it as is. Apparently as is included a class designation they don't like. She held up the scanner. The string of alien characters meant nothing to him, but the tone in her voice did. Pre-Accord military hull. Mac, that ship of yours isn't scrap. It's a warship. He looked down at Sophia's watch sitting dead and dark in her cradle, 300 meters of forgotten violence, and felt something in his chest go very still and very calm, the way it used to, right before a convoy rolled into bad territory. Well, he said, that explains the weird wiring. The Concorde didn't bother with diplomacy. Their dropship cracked open on the docking ring and 6 enforcers came down the gangway in armor that shimmered faint blue at the joints. Energy shielding, the kind that made small arms fire a joke. Mac had seen the briefing packets Priya kept on file, the ones warning yard workers what not to engage. 6.5 feet of segmented plate, faceless behind a single sensor band, moving with the unhurried confidence of something that had never lost a fight against Tier 3 labor, because Tier 3 labor wasn't supposed to fight back. The lead enforcer's voice crackled out over a station-wide override, flat and translated and utterly without interest in the answer it expected. This designation claims Salvage Unit 411, Pre-Accord Military Classification, under Concord Repossession Writ. Surrender the vessel and associated personnel for processing. Priya's assistant, a thin Thren kid named Toma, who couldn't have been more than 20 in human years, who'd been sweeping Base 6 since before Mac arrived, made the mistake of standing his ground between the enforcers and the children's quarters. The enforcer didn't slow down. A single shot from a shoulder-mounted emitter took Toma through the chest, a flash of white-blue light and the smell of cooked protein, and the kid folded sideways into a stack of scrap conduit without making a sound. Ilo screamed. The 9-year-old had been hauling a crate of fuel cells toward the recycler, and now she froze, and the enforcer who'd killed Toma reached out with one armored gauntlet and closed it around 11-year-old Vex's collar like he was picking up a stray cat. Tier 3 specimens are non-combatant assets, the enforcer said, almost bored, dragging the kicking, screaming boy off his feet. Compliance is recommended. Mac Delgado had spent 8 years as a combat engineer in the United States Marine Corps. He had cleared roads under fire, built bridges under fire, and once spent 11 hours digging 2 squad mates out of a collapsed culvert while taking sporadic small arms from a tree line he couldn't see. He had left the Corps not because he'd lost his nerve, but because a 6-year-old girl with a port in her chest had needed her dad more than the Marine Corps needed an engineer, and there wasn't a version of him that would have made a different call. He did not have a different call to make now either. Hey, Mac said, and his voice carried across the bay in a way that made the enforcer's sensor band twitch toward him. That's not yours. The enforcer didn't even bother answering him directly. The translated reply came over the open channel instead, mechanical, dismissive, final. Tier 3 labor does not possess combat authorization. Stand down or be reclassified as scrap. Mac looked at the plasma cutter in his good hand, then at his other arm, the one with 2.5 pounds of fused titanium under the skin, the one that had absorbed shrapnel that would have taken a regular arm clean off. And he felt the calm get colder and more certain. Reclassify this, he said, and started running. The thing about energy shields Mac had learned in the 2 seconds it took him to cross the catwalk gap was that they weren't actually solid. They were a field, generated from emitters at the joints, and fields had seams, places where two overlapping projections met and had to negotiate who covered what. He'd spent 8 years learning that every system, no matter how advanced, had a seam, a weak point, a place where the engineering had to compromise with reality. Armor was no different from a bridge truss or a culvert wall. Find the seam. Apply force there. Everything failed eventually. You just had to know where to push. He hit the enforcer holding Vex from the blind side, driving the plasma cutter into the gap between shoulder plate and gorget, where the shield emitters had to fight each other for coverage, and pulled the trigger. The cutter wasn't built as a weapon. It was built to slice half-inch steel plate at 4,000 degrees, which, as it turned out, made it an extremely effective weapon when applied directly to an armor seam at point-blank range. The shield flickered, strained, and gave out in a shower of blue sparks, and the plasma arc bit into the meat beneath with a smell Mac hadn't smelled since Helmand and had hoped never to smell again. The enforcer dropped Vex and screamed, a sound the translator didn't bother converting, raw and animal under all that armor, and Mac grabbed the kid by the back of his coveralls and threw him bodily toward the cargo corridor. "Move!" he shouted. "Both of you, go, go, go!" Ilo was already running. Vex stumbled twice before his legs remembered how to work and then bolted after her, and Mac put himself between the kids and the 5 remaining enforcers, plasma cutter humming in his fist like the world's angriest dental drill. "Tier 3 labor does not possess combat authorization," the lead enforcer repeated, like a man reading off a card he'd memorized, raising his emitter arm toward Mac's center mass. "Stand down or be reclassified as scrap." "Yeah, I heard you the first time," Mac said, backing toward the cargo airlock of Sophia's watch, dragging a fallen length of conduit pipe up off the deck with his free hand as he went. Funny thing about reclassifying somebody who used to disarm IEDs for a living, we tend to take it personal. The shot meant for his chest went wide when he twisted, old habits the kind that lived in muscle memory long after the uniform came off, and the conduit pipe came around and caught the shooter across the sensor band hard enough to crack the housing. Not a kill. Didn't need to be a kill. Just needed to buy 3 more seconds. He used them to get Ilo and Vex through the cargo airlock of Sophia's watch and slam the manual override, the heavy old door grinding shut on hydraulics that, against all odds, still had pressure in the lines. "Stay down," he told them through the narrow viewport, 2 terrified faces staring back at him from the dim cargo hold. "Stay quiet. I'm gonna go be annoying for a while." He turned back to the bay where 4 more enforcers were fanning out to flank him, and behind them he could see the dry dock readouts on the wall. Readouts that, now that he looked, weren't dead at all. Sophia's watch had power. Not much. But the ship he'd bought sight unseen with a dead girl's tuition money had defense conduits running warm under the hull. And for the first time since the shooting started, Mac Delgado allowed himself something close to a smile. "Old girl," he said quietly, patting the airlock frame with his titanium hand. "Let's see what you remember how to do." The 4 remaining enforcers didn't rush him, which told Mac something useful. They'd seen what happened to the first one, and whatever passed for fear in a Ve Concord enforcer's chain of command, it was enough to make them cautious. Cautious was good. Cautious meant time, and time was the one resource Mac actually knew how to work with. He backed along the gantry catwalk, drawing them away from the cargo airlock, putting distance and obstacles between the kids and the fight. Behind him, through the thick alloy of Sophia's watch's hull, he could feel something. Not hear it exactly, more a low vibration in his boots like a furnace catching after years cold. The ship was waking up, slowly, reluctantly, but waking up. "This designation repeats," the lead enforcer said, sensor band tracking him with mechanical patience. "Tier 3 labor does not possess combat authorization. Surrender and reclassification will proceed without further casualties." Funny thing about that word, casualties, Mac said, circling toward a stack of scrap conduit he'd been meaning to recycle for a month, and was now extremely glad he hadn't gotten around to. "Back home we had a saying, no plan survives contact with the enemy. You boys rolled in here with a plan that assumed Tier 3 labor rolls over. That plan's already dead. You're just running on inertia now." He grabbed a length of pipe in his good hand and waited, Weight balanced, the old training settling over him like a coat he hadn't worn in years but still fit right. Combat engineers didn't get trained to be triggermen. They got trained to solve problems under fire. Bridges that needed building while people were shooting at you. Charges that needed placing while the clock ran out. Walls that needed coming down before reinforcements arrived. Mac had spent 8 years learning that the difference between a soldier and an engineer was that a soldier solved the enemy standing in front of him, and an engineer solved the entire situation around him. The situation, right now, was 4 armored enforcers between him and 2 hiding kids, in a scrapyard absolutely loaded with industrial hazards nobody had bothered to childproof, because nobody had ever expected Tier 3 labor to be capable of using them. He led the enforcers past the fuel cell racks first, close enough that 2 of them eyed the stacked cells with something that, on a human face, would have been nervousness. Good. Let them be nervous. Nervous men made mistakes, and armored enforcers who'd never lost a fight against unarmed labor were about to discover what mistakes felt like. A canister of patch sealant foam, the kind used to plug microfractures in hull plating, sat where he'd left it that morning on a maintenance cart. Mac scooped it up without breaking stride and put 2 fingers on the nozzle, and when the nearest enforcer rounded the conduit stack to flank him, he sprayed a full burst directly into the sensor band. The foam wasn't a weapon. It expanded fast, though, sealing itself into a hard, blind crust within seconds, exactly what it was built to do on a hull breach. And the enforcer staggered, swinging his weapon arm blind, firing a wild shot that took out a bank of overhead lighting instead of Mac. "That's gonna need a full sensor replacement," Mac said, already moving, already 3 steps further down the catwalk, drawing the other 3 after him like a man leading dogs on a leash he could barely hold. "Manufacturer's warranty's not gonna cover that, by the way. Pretty sure got blinded by hull foam during an illegal repossession voids most service agreements." Behind him, deep in the ship's spine, he felt the vibration climb a notch. Whatever Sophia's watch was waking up into, it was getting closer to the surface. He just had to keep these 4 busy long enough to let her finish remembering. The fertilizer stores were Priya's idea, technically, in that she'd mentioned 3 weeks back that the station's hydroponics bay was overstocked on ammonium nitrate feedstock, and could Mac haul some of it to the recycler when he had a minute. He'd had a minute. He'd also had a working knowledge of improvised explosives that the Marine Corps had spent 8 years drilling into him, and a diesel reserve tank sitting 40 meters from the fertilizer stores that nobody had bothered to separate, because nobody on this station had ever needed to think like a combat engineer before. Mac Delgado had spent the better part of his enlistment learning exactly 2 things in exquisite practical detail: how to build things that held weight, and how to build things that didn't. Ammonium nitrate and fuel oil, mixed in the right ratio and packed into the right housing, was one of the oldest tricks in that second book. Crude and ugly, and devastatingly effective, and he had it rigged into 4 charges along the gantry support struts above Base 6 before the second wave of Concord enforcers had finished regrouping in the docking corridor. He heard them before he saw them. Boots on deck plate, the low hum of shield generators cycling, a Concord officer's voice barking orders in a language the station's translator rendered as clipped and furious. 8 enforcers this time, moving in formation under the gantry, confident in numbers, confident in armor that had never once needed to worry about a Tier 3 laborer with a degree in collapsing things on purpose. The transmission crackled over the open channel as they advanced. "Casualties confirmed. This designation requests reinforcement. Recommend orbital denial protocol." "Denial protocol's gonna have to wait," Mac muttered, crouched behind a stack of hull plating with the detonator wire pinched between 2 fingers of his good hand. "You're standing under a load-bearing structure, fellas. That's a building code violation in like 9 systems I can think of." He squeezed the trigger. The gantry didn't so much fall as arrive. 4 tons of structural steel coming down across the formation in a single shrieking collapse that buried 3 enforcers outright and sent the rest scrambling for cover that didn't exist in an open bay. The shockwave rattled Mac's teeth even from 40 meters back, and the dust that boiled up off the wreckage smelled like fertilizer and diesel, and the particular acrid stink of shield generators failing catastrophically all at once. "Yeah," he said, watching the wreckage settle, ears ringing. "That's a total loss. Don't even bother with the parts." 2 enforcers crawled clear of the wreckage. armor scorched, shields flickering and dying. And that was when Mac realized the fight wasn't over so much as it had changed shape. He'd taken 8 off the board. He had no idea how many more were still inbound, and he was one man with a dwindling supply of improvised demolitions and a couple of kids hiding in a ship he didn't fully know how to fly. What he did know, climbing back up into the access corridor that ran along Sophia's watch's spine, was machinery. And the magnetic clamp array that ran the length of Bay 6's outer wall, the system used to hold derelict hulls steady during salvage work, capable of generating a magnetic field strong enough to rip a man's tool belt off from across the room, was, as far as Mac could tell, just a much, much bigger version of every overcharged industrial system he'd spent 20 years learning to push past its rated limits. He found the third wave already inside the corridor when he doubled back for Priya. 6 more enforcers, breaching through an auxiliary hatch with the kind of methodical patience that told him these ones had learned from the gantry. They moved in pairs, covering each other, shields interlocking at the seams he'd already exploited twice. Mac didn't have a plasma cutter handy. What he had was a maintenance panel, a handful of mismatched wire, and 40 years of bone-deep familiarity with the principle that any system designed to hold something in place could, with sufficient encouragement, be persuaded to do the opposite at considerably higher voltage. He overloaded the clamp array's containment regulators by hand, feeding the feedback loop directly into the corridor's structural grounding instead of letting it bleed off safely, and the resulting magnetic surge did 2 things almost simultaneously. It ripped every loose piece of ferrous metal in the corridor, including 6 sets of segmented conquered armor, toward the walls hard enough to crack bone beneath the plating, and it blew the corridor's outer seal wide open into vacuum. The boarding party didn't get a chance to scream. The translator caught one fragmented transmission before the channel went to static, panicked in a way none of the others had been. The human is interfacing with pre-accord systems. Abort, abort. Mac braced himself against a support strut as the corridor howled and emptied itself into the black, the emergency bulkhead grinding shut behind the depressurization a half-second after the last enforcer's boots left the deck. His ears popped hard enough to draw blood, and somewhere in the chaos a stray shot, fired wild by someone he never even saw, caught him across the left forearm in a long, screaming graze of plasma heat that should, by every law of human anatomy Mac understood, have taken the arm clean off at the elbow. It didn't. He looked down through the smoke and torn coverall sleeve at bone showing white through cooked synthetic skin, at the dull gray gleam of titanium plate scored but unbroken beneath it, and felt nothing where there should have been agony, just a strange distant heat and the absent ringing knowledge that something was very wrong with his arm, and his body hadn't gotten around to telling him about it properly yet. Field expedient, he said out loud, mostly to keep himself moving, voice gone thin and far away in his own ears. We'll call that field expedient. He kept walking. There wasn't really another option that made sense to him. Priya found him in the spine corridor of Sophia's watch, swaying, one hand braced against the bulkhead, the other hanging at his side in a ruin of blood and exposed bone that he was apparently still using like nothing much had changed about it. Mac, her voice cracked. Mac, your arm. It's fine, he said, which was a lie. But it was the kind of lie a man told because the alternative was sitting down, and he didn't think he'd get back up if he sat down. Where's Ilo? Where's Vex? Cargo hold, safe. The Concorde ships, Mac, there's more of them inbound. I'm reading at least 2 more. Yeah, he said. Figured. He looked past her, down the corridor toward the ship's dim, half-dead heart, and something in him that had been holding together on pure stubbornness for the last 20 minutes started, finally, to give. Get the kids further back. Seal yourself in. I'm gonna go see if this old girl's got one more trick in her. He didn't wait for Priya to argue. He didn't think he had the time, and some part of him, the part that had spent 8 years learning that bridges fail without warning and convoys get hit when you're not braced for it, knew with cold clarity that he didn't have much left in the tank. The ship's core chamber was a cathedral of dead conduit and dormant machinery. 3 stories of pre-accord engineering that hadn't drawn full power in longer than Mac had been alive. And at its center sat a single activation column that pulsed, faint and slow, with the only light in the whole dark room. He didn't know what Sophia's watch had been built for. Not really. Not beyond the word Warship Priya had used with fear in her voice. He didn't need to know. He just needed it to do one thing: seal the bay, lock the enforcers out by the kids' time. He got his good hand on the activation column, and his ruined one braced against the housing for balance, and he poured everything he had left. Every ounce of training, every year of grief he'd welded into purpose, every reason he'd spent a dead girl's future trying to build one for somebody else's kids, into bringing the old ship's heart back to life. It worked. He felt it work, felt the deck hum under his boots as bulkheads 3 decks up ground shut with a sound like a held breath finally released, sealing Bay 6 off from the rest of the station, locking out the next wave before it ever made it through the door. He also felt the 4th enforcer come up behind him in the dark, the one who'd slipped past Priya's warning, weapon already raised at point-blank range on a 9-year-old girl who'd frozen halfway across the chamber trying to reach him. Mac didn't think about it. There wasn't a version of him that would have thought about it. He put himself between Elo and the shot, and the impact took him high in the side just below the ribs, with a heat that felt almost gentle compared to what his arm had already been through. And the deck came up to meet him slow and strange, like falling through water. The last thing he heard before the dark closed in was his own voice, thinner than he'd ever heard it, saying something that didn't quite make sense even to him. "Tell the foreman," he murmured. To nobody, to everybody, to a Caterpillar plant in Toledo 11,000 light years and 20 years gone. "I'm taking sick leave." The Threnaccord rescue cutter Wide Margin arrived at Hollow Reach 4 hours later, responding to a station-wide distress beacon that Priya had triggered the moment the bulkheads sealed. What the rescue team found, working their way through Base 6's wreckage, didn't match anything in their briefing. A corridor of disabled Concord enforcers, 11 in total between the gantry collapse, the decompression, and the scattered wreckage near the cargo airlock. Some dead, most simply broken, armor melted and cracked in patterns that made no engineering sense to anyone reading the scene cold. A trail of blood, too much of it, leading from a dormant warship's core chamber back through a station nobody had thought capable of mounting a defense at all. And at the end of that trail, a single human male unconscious, missing roughly 40% of his blood volume, with a forearm wound so severe the field medic initially logged it as a probable amputation before discovering with some confusion that the wound terminated against an internal structure too dense for her scanner to read cleanly. His marrow density alone could anchor a hull plate, she said more to herself than to anyone else, running the scan a second time because the first result seemed like equipment error. This species heals faster unconscious than we do conscious. She wasn't wrong exactly. By the time they'd stabilized him on the cutter's medical deck, Mac's vitals had done something that made 3 different Thren physicians gather around his readout in a state of professional bewilderment. His heart rate, which had bottomed out at 38 beats per minute during the worst of the blood loss, a number that should have meant cardiac failure in a species built like his, held steady there instead of dropping further, stubborn and slow and somehow sufficient. His core temperature sat at 33.1 noners, hypothermic by human standards, dangerously cold by any standard, and his body simply refused to let it drop the rest of the way to where it should have killed him. Later scans of the recovered titanium plating in his forearm would put his bone density, where the metal met the original bone, at roughly 2.3 times the average baseline for adult Thren skeletal structure. A fact that got passed around the medical deck in the tone of people discussing something they weren't sure they believed. "You don't disable a Marine combat engineer," Priya told the medic sitting in the chair beside Mac's cot with Ilo asleep against her shoulder and Vex curled at the foot of the bed, refusing to be moved despite 3 separate requests. She'd heard him say it once, weeks ago, half joking about an old injury. It hadn't sounded like a joke anymore. "You just give him more parts to use." The medic didn't have an answer for that. Nobody on the Wide Margin did. 6 days passed before Mac Delgado opened his eyes again. He woke slow, the way a man wakes after the body has spent a long time arguing with itself about whether waking up was worth the trouble, and the first thing he registered was the smell. Recycled air, antiseptic, and underneath it, faint and impossible, something that for one disoriented half-second made him think of Toledo in January. Cold air off the lake, snow on the windshield, his daughter's mittens drying on the radiator. It was gone as soon as he placed it, just station ventilation doing something strange to his half-conscious brain. But it left an ache behind that had nothing to do with the wound in his side. The second thing he registered was Ilo's face, 6 inches from his own, watching him with the unblinking patience of a kid who'd apparently decided that staring hard enough would speed up the recovery process. "You're alive," she informed him, like this was news he might not have, and something in her voice cracked halfway through the sentence. "Yeah," Max said, throat like sandpaper, voice barely there. "Looks that way." He spent the better part of that first day just remembering how his own body worked, relearning the geography of pain, the deep ache under his ribs where the shot had taken him, the strange dull pressure in his rebuilt forearm, the bone-deep exhaustion that made even sitting up feel like a negotiation he was likely to lose. Priya brought him broth that tasted like nothing in particular, and sat with him while he choked it down, and somewhere in the haze of that first day, she told him carefully, that there was a problem waiting for him as soon as he was strong enough to stand. The problem arrived on day 6, in the form of a Threnaccord magistrate named Sessa Vole, who walked into Hollow Reach's makeshift infirmary with 2 armed escorts and a data tablet full of regulatory citations, and informed the room, without preamble, that Marcus Delgado's salvage license was under formal review. "Unauthorized weaponization of pre-accord military technology," she said, reading off the tablet in a flat, official cadence that suggested she'd delivered this exact speech to a dozen other people who'd ended up much worse off than Mac had. "Engagement of a licensed Concord repossession unit without combat authorization. Activation of a dormant Tier 1 warship system without registry clearance. Any one of these is grounds for permanent revocation of salvage rights across all 3 arms. Together, they constitute the most significant unauthorized engagement violation this office has processed in 11 years. Mac came through the infirmary doorway about halfway through that sentence, leaning hard on a crutch Priya had welded together out of conduit pipe and packing foam, his coveralls, the same stained, scorched Carhartts he'd been wearing the day this whole mess started because some habits a man didn't break even after nearly dying. Hanging loose on a frame that had lost 15 pounds it didn't have to spare. The scar tracking up his left forearm was still an angry, healing red, visible where the sleeve had been cut away for the dressings. And he looked, by any reasonable measure, like a man who should still have been in bed. He didn't look like he cared what was reasonable. "You people catalog ships by tonnage," he said, voice rough but steady, cutting straight through whatever Vole had been about to say next. "I catalog them by what they're for. That ship out there," he tipped his head toward the dry dock, toward Sophia's watch sitting dark and silent in her cradle, patched and scarred but holding, "was built to end civilizations. I just reminded it what that means for about 20 minutes against people who came here to kill kids over a registry flag." Vole's escorts shifted, hands drifting toward sidearms they didn't quite raise. Vole herself didn't move at all, watching him with an expression Mac couldn't quite read, somewhere between irritation and something more careful. "The regulations exist for a reason, Salvager," she said. "Pre-accord military systems in the hands of unregistered operators have caused—" "I know what they've caused. I read the same briefing packets Priya's got filed in this station's database, same as everybody else." Mac shifted his weight off the crutch, just slightly, just enough to stand a little straighter, and his voice dropped, quiet and even, the kind of quiet that made the room go very still. "I didn't ask for a warship. I bought a wreck nobody else wanted because it was the only thing in my price range that might let me keep a couple kids fed. Your Concord enforcers decided that wreck was worth killing people over. I decided it wasn't worth letting them." He let that sit a moment, looking around the room, at Priya, at Elo and Vex pressed together in the doorway, at the magistrate and her 2 escorts, who suddenly looked considerably less certain of their position than they had a minute ago. "Next time something with my name on it gets touched," Max said, "I won't be polite about getting it back." Nobody in the room said anything for a long moment. Vole looked at her tablet, then at the scarred man leaning on a crutch made of scrap pipe, then at the dry dock readouts visible through the infirmary's observation window. The same readouts that, station records would later confirm, showed an 11-enforcer Concorde boarding party reduced to wreckage by a single Tier 3 laborer with a plasma cutter and a working knowledge of fertilizer. Whatever calculation she ran, it didn't take long. "This office," she said carefully, tablet already dimming in her hand, "will note the engagement as defensive action under emergency provision, pending further review." She paused at the door, looking back at him with something that might, in a different mood, have been respect. "You should know, Salvager. There are very few people in this sector the Concorde backs down from twice." "Then they shouldn't have made it personal," Max said. "The first time." She left without further argument. Her escorts followed, and the infirmary doorway stood empty for a long moment before Priya let out a breath she'd apparently been holding the entire conversation. It took another 2 weeks before Mac was steady enough on his feet to make the walk out to Dry Dock 4 without the crutch. And he did it the same way he'd done most things since Sophia died. Alone, early, before the rest of the station's skeleton crew was up and moving so nobody would see his face if it did something he didn't want it to do. He stood under the looming black hull of his ship for a long time, looking up at the name he'd painted there months ago, half faded now from the fight, scorch marks tracking up the hull plating in long black streaks where the gantry collapse had scorched the paint. Somebody, Priya, probably, or one of the yard hands, had already started welding a proper registry plate beneath it, the formal designation Hollow Reach would need to log the vessel under Threnaccord salvage law. Mac picked up a marker and filled in the blank field on the plate himself, in block letters the same way he'd painted the hull the first time. Sophia's watch. Class: Pre-Accord military, reclassified civilian salvage, owner of record, Monsieur Delgado. He stood back and looked at it for a while, the cold burn of standing under a ship paid for with his daughter's future settling into something quieter than grief, something closer to peace than he'd felt in longer than he wanted to admit. That night, he found Elo and Vex curled up together in the cargo hold of Sophia's watch, asleep on a pile of salvaged blankets Priya had scrounged from somewhere, safe and warm and breathing easy in a ship that had, 20 years before either of them was born, and 11,000 light years from a small house in Toledo, very nearly ended somebody's civilization, and had instead, on one bad afternoon, ended up saving 2 kids who didn't have anybody else to do it. Max stood in the hatchway for a long moment watching them sleep, thinking about a hospital room with a window that looked out over a parking lot, and a 6-year-old girl with a port in her chest who used to laugh, in her last good week, at the dumbest things. At the way he did his Donald Duck voice. At the nurse who couldn't say her name right. At absolutely nothing at all, just laughing because laughing still worked, even when everything else had stopped. He thought about what she would have said, seeing this. 2 kids safe in the cargo hold of a ship that bore her name. "Yeah," he said quietly, to the dark, to the ship, to nobody in particular. She'd have liked that.